Welcome, comrades. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We have with us again Tony Greenstein and Thomas Suárez. Very pleased to have both of you experts on the question of Zionism and the Holocaust, which we're discussing tonight. We did, of course, discuss it last week when we looked at Norman Finkelstein's book, and we made a very good start then talking about the instrumentalization and the weaponization of the Holocaust for the purpose of, for example, justifying what is happening to Palestinians today. So we're having a closer look at this today with Tony first starting for about 20, 25, 30 minutes, and then Tom, and then we can have discussion and questions from the floor. So without further ado, Tony, please. We cannot see you. I think your camera is going.
Oh, right. Okay,
That's better. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, comrades. Right, if you can give me 5 minutes notice when I am due to wind up, I should be extremely grateful.
No problem.
It is particularly appropriate to discuss the question of Zionism during the Holocaust and related issues, especially as we are in the middle of Israel's genocidal war on the people of Gaza. And I'm often asked, what is the relevance of concentrating on the Zionist record during the Holocaust? The most notable person who questions this, and he's a very good comrade, is Craig Murray, whose argument goes basically like this, that under extreme pressure in the dire circumstances of Nazi occupation and so on, of course, people made decisions which later they may regret or what have you, but that was a question of human error, judgment, fallibility, and so on. And it's a reasonable point to make. My response is this, that the Zionist movement, both before and during the Holocaust, did not make errors. It didn't succumb to pressure, but it very much took advantage of the situation, because when the Nazis rose, when Hitler took power in January the 30th, 1933, of course, Jews were absolutely aghast, and they began immediately a spontaneous boycott of everything to do with Nazi Germany, economically, politically, and so on. The one group amongst the Jewish people who welcomed almost the rise of the Nazis to power, who saw it as being so advantageous to their own movement, was the Zionist movement. And I'm talking about the leadership of the Zionists, because of course many individual Zionists, the rank and file, if you like, were equally horrified by what was happening. But to people like Ben-Gurion and others, then this was a great advantage. And if I can just give you really a few quotes, if I can find them, because this is always my difficulty. The Zionists saw Hitler's regime, as I say, as a golden opportunity to prosper. Hitler's victory could only bolster Zionist fortunes. Francis Nicosia, who's written about this extensively, 2 books, although he is a Zionist supporter, I have to add. He's a Raoul Hilberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at Vermont University, wrote in his book Zionism and Nazi Germany, Zionism and Anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. He said, so positive was its assessment, the Zionist assessment of the situation, that as early as April 1933, the Zionist Federation announced its determination to take advantage of the crisis to win over the traditionally assimilationist German Jewry to Zionism, because I don't know whether you know, but if you read my book, you will, that just 2% of German Jews considered themselves Zionists or paid the shekel to be part of the Zionist movement. Burl Katznelson, who was a founder of the Israeli Labour Party, Mapai, an editor of its newspaper, Davar, as well as effectively David Ben-Gurion's deputy. Ben-Gurion was the chair of the Jewish agency, the Zionist government in waiting, and he was the first prime minister of Israel. He saw the rise of Hitler as an opportunity to build and flourish like none we have ever had or ever will have. Sorry, that was Burl Katznelson. Ben-Gurion was even more optimistic. He said the Nazis' victory would become a fertile force for Zionism. And one of the leaders of the German Zionist movement, Joachim Prinz, Rabbi Joachim Prinz, who later became deputy president of the World Jewish Congress, admitted it was morally disturbing to be considered as the favored children of the Nazi government, particularly when it dissolved the anti-Zionist youth groups and seemed in other ways to prefer the Zionists. The Zionists asked for a more Zionist behavior. And I've quoted in my book people like Emil Ludwig, the world famous biographer, who offered the opinion that Hitler will be forgotten in a few years, but he will have a beautiful monument in Palestine. You know, the coming of the Nazis was rather a welcome thing. Thousands who seemed completely lost to Judaism were brought back to the fold by Hitler. And for that, I am personally very grateful to him. Chaim Nachman Bialik, who is the national poet of the Zionist movement, volunteered that, quote, Hitlerism has perhaps saved German Jewry, which was being assimilated into annihilation. I mean, that is an example of the Zionist attitude towards the rise of the Nazis. But this was nothing new. It wasn't out of the blue, because Zionism had always had that attitude towards anti-Semitism. Therefore, they saw the Nazis as being really very little different. Let me put it in perspective. Zionism as a movement arose as a result of the pogroms in Tsarist Russia in the Pale Settlement, in particular the 1881 pogroms in Odessa, which was a major city on the Black Sea. And Zionism was different from all other Jewish reactions. And it wasn't unique in this, in that it accepted the framework of the anti-Semites. Namely, the anti-Semites said, you do not belong, you are a different people, we do not wish you to be part of us, etc. And the Zionists accepted that anti-Semitism was inherent in the non-Jew, that you could not fight it. And if you could not fight it, really, there was no point in trying to fight it or to combat it. And Theodor Herzl, who was the founder of political Zionism, said, and I quote, in Paris, and this was in his diaries, I think page 8, he said, in Paris, I achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and to pardon. Above all, I recognized the emptiness and the futility of trying to combat, inverted commas, anti-Semitism. And this really was the Zionist attitude. Theodor Herzl was the founder of political Zionism. He was president of the world, or the Zionist organization, and he chaired the Zionist Congresses, the first one of which was held in Basel in Switzerland in 1897. It's quite interesting, given all the accusations of anti-Semitism that are made today against anyone who supports the Palestinians or who is anti-Zionist, because The Zionist Congress was supposed to be held not in Basel, but in Munich, South Germany, where there was a relatively large Jewish population. But the Jewish population rose up in uproar and made it very clear to the authorities that they did not want the Zionist Congress to be held there. They accused the authorities of anti-Semitism for even thinking of staging this Congress. So Herzl was forced to switch venues, and it was held instead in Basel, which I think is on Lake Geneva in Switzerland, where there were very few Jews and where he would not have trouble from them. And this was not unique. This was not unique at all. I mean, Herzl describes in his diaries, and I don't know whether anyone's read them, but they are worth reading. They're 4 volumes, over 1,500 pages. And Herzl, I say, who was before his time in many ways, spent his short life traveling around meeting the various leaders of royalty, prime ministers, the Ottoman sultans, and even the Pope. And one of the people he met was the Grand Duke of Baden, who was the uncle of the Kaiser of Germany. And the Grand Duke told Herzl that, of course, I support Zionism, like most reactionaries did. But he said, I just have one problem. If I'm seen to support Zionism, people will accuse me of anti-Semitism. And this was the attitude at the time, that Zionism, by accepting that Jews did not belong, by accepting that Jews formed a separate people and nationality, were in essence Jewish anti-Semites. So bear that in mind when today the Zionists accuse people of anti-Semitism, because when Zionism was formed, it was accused of being anti-Semitism in Jewish garb, in Jewish clothes, nothing more. And we also need to, I think, remember that I'm told that Bar is not on Lake Geneva. I accept a correction to my geographical ignorance. However, we should remember that Zionism was not a Jewish invention. I mean, today the Jewish rabbi Mervis, Ephraim Mervis, will say Judaism and Zionism are intertwined. Zionism has been around for 2,000 years and so on, which of course begs the question, if Zionism has been around for 2,000 years, why the Jews didn't think of establishing a state much earlier and why they left it to the late colonial era. But the first Zionists were Christian evangelicals, going back to the Christian restorationists of about the mid-16th century. It was the Christian imperialist, Disraeli, Palmerston, above all, Lord Shaftesbury, who was well known as a humanitarian, but who opposed Jewish emancipation in Britain, who were the most ardent Zionists. So this set the scene, if you like, for the Zionist collaboration with the Nazis. And when I say the Nazis came to power in 1933, most Jews reacted spontaneously by organizing a boycott of Nazi Germany. But to the Zionists, this was, in the words of a letter from the German Zionist Federation to Hitler, a letter that was never answered on the 21st of June, 1933, said, boycotts are un-Zionist. We wish to be constructive. We wish to work with people, not to oppose them. And in fact, in August 1933, the Zionists concluded a trade agreement with the Nazis, Havas, and there's a very good book on it by a Zionist, a right-wing Zionist, Edwin Black, on Havas, the transfer agreement, which basically meant that Jews could put their money into a frozen bank account. They could emigrate with £1,000 to Palestine. They would get in without having to be counted on the certificate scheme that was in operation. And then their money in Germany would be used to buy machinery and other goods, which would then be exported to Palestine. And in that way, the Zionists helped to keep, if you like, the machinery in German factories going. But what was more important about it, because Havas was relatively insignificant financially for Germany, though it was important for Palestine, was that it broke the Jewish, and not just the Jewish, but the labor movement boycott of Nazi Germany at a time when Nazi Germany was in danger of actually collapsing in the winter of 1933. And that is really important to remember. Ken Livingstone mentioned this, and of course he was immediately attacked as an anti-Semite and so on and so forth. But he simply stumbled on the truth, if you like. Zionists today argue that Havas was intended to save German Jews, and that is an absolute lie. For a start, of the 50,000 Jews from Germany who got out and went to Palestine, just 20,000 emigrated via the Havas scheme. They were the wealthiest German Jews. They were the German Jews who could have gone anywhere. So Havas saved virtually no one. What it did do was immensely strengthen the Nazi regime at a time when it was most weak. And that, if you like, was the contribution of the Nazi movement towards the anti-Nazi fight. In other words, it was no contribution at all. Because really, the Zionists had no objection to what the Nazis were arguing, which was that the Jews did not belong. They had no objection to the Nuremberg laws of 1935, which argued that Jews, laid down that Jews were not nationals or citizens of the German state. They were outsiders. And I think it's probably best summed up by a guy called Jacob Klatskin. And again, I'll just bring up this quote. He was the editor of Die Welt for 2 years, between 1909 and 1911. He was the co-founder of the Encyclopedia Judaica, and he was, if you like, one of the foremost theoreticians of the Zionist movement. And he said openly, if we do not admit the rightfulness of anti-Semitism, we deny the rightfulness of our own nationalism. Instead of establishing societies for defense against the anti-Semites who want to reduce our rights, we should establish societies for defense against our friends who desire to defend our rights. So this, if you like, was the Zionist attitude during the Nazi era. But the question is, what relevance, in a sense, does it have to today? And I would argue that what we're seeing in Gaza now, and the openly declared sentiments of Israeli and Zionist leaders, is colored by the Nazi era itself. I mean, it's always been said that you shouldn't compare Nazis and Zionists. After all, Israel is not exterminating the Palestinians. It's simply trying to ethnically cleanse them. But of course, we should remember that when the Nazis came to power in 1933, their program was not one of extermination. It was also of ethnic cleansing. The Nazis wished to rid Germany of Jews and later Europe of Jews. It only began on the road to extermination with the invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa, in June 1941, when the killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen, operated in the wake of the German army, mopping up Jews in Ukraine, White Russia, and so on. They killed at least 1 million people by shooting them, forcing them to dig their own ditches, and then putting them into it. And we see scenes very similar to this in Gaza today, I'm afraid, where people are simply being lined up and shot out of sight. But there are very, very credible reports about that. So Zionism, and I said, maybe I can share my screen. I shall try. Where is the sharing button? Maybe, Tina, can you let me?
You should be able to do it, yeah. Try
I've
sharing
got the sharing button here. Oh yeah, there I have. Sorry, yes, I do have it. In can people see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, in
Well, it's a picture of you being an article about you. Is that what you want to share?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I was at the Palestine Expo, which was a festival of Palestinian culture and politics in London in 2019. And I simply spoke from the floor at a workshop, but the Jewish Chronicle blew this up into a full-page article. Infamous anti-Israeli Israel activist, that's me, called Jewish state Hitler's bastard offspring. I don't really think today that anyone could deny that that was the case. If I think, yeah, screen sharing stopped now. And that is the case. That's the case. And if you look, I actually recommend very much. I'm just trying to find it now, and I probably won't because I very much recommend the South Africa. If anyone hasn't got a copy, that they get a copy of the South African submission to the International Court of Justice, because it actually details very much the genocidal expressions of Israeli ministers, including Prime Minister Netanyahu. On 13th of October, he said, "We are striking enemies with unprecedented might." On 15th of October, when already nearly 3,000 Palestinians had been killed, he said that the situation was one of a struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle. Zionists love using the metaphor of a jungle when describing Palestinians. And maybe his most famous remark was on the 28th of October, as a land invasion was being prepared. And he invoked the biblical story of Amalek. Amalek was a tribe which ambushed the children of Israel as they were wandering from Egypt to the promised land. I mean, it's a complete myth. It never happened. As Shlomo Sands points out, Egypt was also in control of Palestine, or Eretz Yisrael, as they called it. So, I mean, the children of Israel would have been wandering from the frying pan into the fire, as it were. So it didn't happen, but it's a nice story anyway. And part of this story is this tribe, the Amalek, ambushed the children of Israel, and God in the Bible commands them to wipe them out, every man, woman, child, and beast. So, I mean, this was the moral that Netanyahu invoked when it came to the invasion and occupation of Gaza, which was clearly genocidal in intent. And we've had many, many other similar descriptions. Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, when launching the war in the first place, spoke of the Palestinians being human animals. And if you go to my book, I don't remember which page, but Himmler, when giving a lecture, a talk to senior SS officers in Posen, in Poland now it is, on the 4th of October 1943, and again on the 6th of October of 1943, he was justifying the Holocaust, explaining why it was necessary to exterminate the Jews. And he described them in exactly the same terms as human animals. So we can see the poisoned waters that Zionism fishes in. Ideologically, there is a congruence. And in fact, some Israeli rabbis have said, well, Hitler was right, he just got the wrong people. And we all know that Netanyahu, in his lecture or his talk to the Zionist Congress, which is held, I think, every 5 years now in Jerusalem in 2015, tried to blame the Palestinians for the Holocaust. He said when the Mufti of Jerusalem, who was the British appointed leader of the Palestinians, who met Hitler in November 1941, that it was him who gave Hitler the idea of extermination, that before that they were simply content with expulsion. I mean, even Zionist historians like Yehuda Bor called this out for the nonsense it was, because of course the Holocaust had started in June 1941. I say the Holocaust, of course, the Jewish Holocaust, because it's arguable, Henry Feingold and other historians have argued that the Holocaust started in October 1939 with the extermination of the disabled and the handicapped, which was stopped, or at least officially stopped, after an attack on it in the sermon by Bishop Garland in September 1941. But as I say, these are the poisoned waters that Zionism fishes in.
Okay, Tony, you've spoken for 25 minutes, just to let you know.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, it's really interesting. So it's, maybe 5 more minutes.
Okay, yes, of course. I said at the beginning that we should not confuse the Zionist leadership with individual Zionists. And I'll give you an example of this. In the United States, there was a group, the Emergency Committee to Save the Jews of Europe. It was led by two dissident revisionist Zionists, that is nominally on the right, Shmuel Merlin and Peter Bergson, who campaigned vigorously for action to be taken to save the remnants of Jewry. And they were vigorously opposed by the leadership of the American Zionist movement, in particular Rabbi Stephen Weiss and Nachum Goldman, who was president of the World Jewish Congress. Goldman even suggested to the State Department that they should deport Bergson. They resented very much the idea that anything should be done to distract from building the Jewish state, because for the Zionists, the main task at hand was building the Jewish state. Saving Jews of Europe really was not on their agenda. Now, I want to quote, if I can, a historian. If you give me one moment. Yes. In 1938, President Roosevelt called the Evian Conference, which was held in the spa town of Evian in France, to see if the nations could deal with the Jewish refugee problem. I mean, this was not a serious attempt to solve it. On the contrary, nations and states were allowed to attend on the basis they didn't have to alter their previous immigration policy. But the Zionists were extremely afraid that something might be done. And Christopher Sykes, in his book, Crossroads to Israel, and Sykes, who was a son of Sir Mark Sykes of the Sykes-Picot Treaty, wrote, and I quote from it, "From the start, they, that is the Zionist leadership, regarded the whole enterprise with hostile indifference. If the 31 nations had done their duty and shown hospitality to those in dire need, that is the Jewish refugees, then the pressure on the national home and the heightened enthusiasm of Jews with Palestine would both have been relaxed. This was the last thing that the Zionist leaders wished for. Even in the more terrible days ahead, they made no secret of the fact, even when talking to Gentiles, non-Jews, that they did not want Jewish settlements outside Palestine to be successful. The Zionists wanted to do something more for the Jews than merely help them to escape danger. That such was the basic Zionist idea is not a matter of opinion, but a fact abundantly provable by evidence." And Sykes is correct. If I had time, I could go into the evidence, but it is in my book. The logic, if you can call it that, of the Zionists was quite simply this, that anti-Semitism would follow the Jews wherever they went. The only way to be free of it was to establish your own state. Therefore, establishing schemes for Jewish refugees to escape to Britain, the United States, or elsewhere was merely postponing the terrible event. And therefore they opposed it as a distraction from building the Jewish state. And I say this was the attitude to Evian, but it was the attitude to every single refugee scheme that was devised in order to enable Jews to escape from Nazi-occupied Europe. And this is the record of the Zionists. And it's really no wonder at all that today in Gaza, the Zionist intent, the Israeli state's intent, is to ethnically cleanse Gaza if they're allowed to get away with it. The leaders of the world, of course, Biden, Sunak, Starmer, etc., who understand this perfectly well, have no real objection to it, despite their pretensions to the contrary. But I think we should be clear, but we should understand very well that when Zionists call people anti-Semites, really, this is just a question of self-projection, nothing more. Okay, I'm sure I've gone over my limit, so I shall stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. And I should say, Tony has written an excellent book called Zionism During the Holocaust, and I do recommend comrades get it. It's even available from Amazon. But I think Tony can also
Don't advise getting it.
send it out. Yeah. Do you want to put it, if you have an email address or something where people can
I'll
order
put it in the chat. Yes, yes.
in the chat.
Yeah, it's also
Thank you very much, Tony. Sorry?
It's also cheaper if you get it from me if you live
Absolutely. And, you know, we cut out the middle capitalist machinery. Thank you very much, Tony. Tom, oh, that's quite the that's quite the intro to follow. What are you focusing on in your opening? Thank you, comrade.
Well, I think I can follow logically from Tony's talk. And I'd like to reinforce that what must be stated and restated is that today's genocide is not the result of 75 years of evolving circumstances. No, the ongoing genocide is and always has been the only possible result of Zionism itself. It's the singular goal of Zionism. Zionism wants river to sea to be cleansed of non-Jews, and in order to do that, and have the Zionists call themselves the natives, Palestinian identity has also to be erased. This is genocide. There's no other word for it. And history, if it's difficult to see for many people in the middle of it, history can help us see what is right in front of our eyes, but to which we have been blinded. Now, Zionism, like any other cult, required brainwashing. That Jewish children were indoctrinated was obvious even to the British, at least as early as 1938, when the British caught the bomber of a bus filled with Palestinian villagers. She, the bomber, was a 12-year-old schoolgirl egged on by the adults. Indeed, Jewish teenagers and children, both boys and girls, were commonly used to carry out terror attacks, and this continued throughout to the ethnic cleansing of 1948. Teachers were threatened or removed if they tried to intervene in the indoctrination of their students in the Zionist settlements, and the students themselves were blocked from advancement if they resisted. Students were also exploited to report their insufficiently Zionist parents. Jews who opposed and tried to warn of the emerging Zionist fascism were, as we mentioned last time we were here, were assassinated or otherwise silenced. Now, it's instructive to look at the reaction of the Jewish agency, the embryonic Israeli government, to the Nazis and ultimately the Holocaust. From the beginning of World War II, that reaction was to lobby the Yishuv, the Jewish settlers, not to enlist in the Allied struggle against the Nazis, because in their way of looking at things, joining the Allied struggle would not serve Zionism. This focus on Zionism at the expense of the war effort ultimately resulted in the so-called Jewish Brigade that an audience member alluded to last time that Tony and I were here, which I'll comment on if anyone is still interested. The Jewish agency reaction was to conduct a massive theft ring of Allied weapons and munitions, as if, as one British military record put it, as if paid by Hitler himself. It was to continue its terrorism in Palestine, taking resources and personnel away from the war effort. Now, the British begged the Zionists to stop the terrorism until Hitler was defeated, but to no avail. Interesting to look at the prominent journalist Robert Welch, who had fled the Nazis. Now, he warned the Zionist leaders in Palestine, he warned them that the Zionists have not yet understood that the enemy, the Nazis, seeks the destruction of the Jews. We, who have been here only a few years, we know what Nazism is. Zionists, rather, are, his quote, taking part in the crash of European Jewry only as spectators. And I'm still quoting him. They do not want to fight against Hitler because his fascist methods are also theirs. In 1943, a man in the settlements risked his life to warn about the threat of Zionism. For his safety, he was referred to by the codename Zed. Now, he described Zionism as a parallel movement to Nazism and warned that the Zionist indoctrination of Jewish youth was producing a society of extremists who will use any method necessary to achieve Zionist goals. And he pointed out that as fascism in Europe was demonstrating, such a society is very difficult to undo once it has taken root. Now, this was anonymous testimony. How trustworthy is it? Well, I found in the National Archives here in Britain, I found a private letter in which the man is identified. He was the senior inspector of Jewish schools in Palestine. A 1943 report by U.S. intelligence described Zionism in Palestine as, quote, a type of nationalism, which in any other country would be stigmatized as retrograde Nazism, and importantly and presciently stated that anti-Semitism was essential to Zionism. In my view, this is key to the success of the Zionist cult today. Zionism has made anti-Semitism into a fetish, the high altar that gives Zionists meaning. The cult fears nothing greater than an end to anti-Jewish bigotry, or more accurately, to an end to what it can label as anti-Jewish bigotry. How did the Jewish Agency treat young survivors of the Holocaust? Well, it was to conduct a massive kidnapping operation of orphans of Jewish background that had been adopted by European families when their parents perished years earlier, and to block Jewish adoptive homes in England for young survivors still in the camps. The children were needed to serve the settler project in Palestine as demographic fodder. That was their only value. Behind closed doors, the Jewish Agency discussed its enemies, and what it considered enemies in the 1940s says quite a lot about the present. Its enemies were democracy, the Atlantic Charter, which of course became the basis for the United Nations, Reconstruction, because they were afraid, as Tony has already described, they were afraid that with the improvement of conditions in Europe, the pressure on Palestine would subside. And the Jewish Agency feared a fall in anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism always having been Zionism's drug, without which it would be irrelevant. The agency blamed what it believed to be declining anti-Semitism in the United States on what it called America's, quote, democratic attitude. By 1946, Zionist terrorism had become the defining daily challenge of life in Palestine. Anyone or anything that kept Palestine a functioning society was a target of the Zionists. So trains, roads, bridges, communications, oil facilities, and Coast Guard stations were constantly being bombed. Utility workers, telephone repairmen, railway workers, bomb disposal personnel were murdered. Police, and especially Jewish police, were long a favored target of the Zionists and were gunned down by the dozens. Among the smaller terror organizations that popped up was one specifically dedicated to Zionist long-running fear of Jews befriending non-Jews, the ultimate fear, of course, being polluting what for the Zionists was the pure Jewish race. As a sample of its methods, the terror gang is said to have doused a disobedient Jewish girl with acid, severely injuring her and blinding her in one eye. I should add, by the way, that the 1946 bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, the only Zionist terror attack that's commonly known now, is contrary to what is written in most history books, not the most deadly Zionist terror attack during the Mandate period. Even Irgun bombings of Palestinian markets killed more people than died in the King David Hotel attack. Now, I think the reason that we know about King David is because since it housed the British colonial establishment, the Zionists could pass it off as a military target. Now, the most deadly attack during the Mandate period was the Jewish Agency's 1940 bombing of the Patria vessel, bringing Jewish refugees from the war. Some people argue that that's an exception. I don't. But nor was the terror confined to Palestine. For example, more deadly than the King David Hotel would have been, were it successful, would have been the bombing of an Allied train in Austria, which would have sent the train off a deep trestle into a deep abyss, killing the almost 200 civilians and Allied troops aboard. Happily, that one failed. Zionist terror was aided by the Jewish Agency's phenomenal intelligence network. The agency had informers all the way to high-placed sympathetic US officials, such that the British learned not even to trust direct messages to then US President Truman. Even when UNSCOP, the UN committee that would decide Palestine's future, when UNSCOP visited Palestine in the summer of 1947, the agency had already replaced the committee members' drivers with spies. It had replaced the waiters at the main restaurant they frequented with spies, and most productively sent 5 young women to serve as what they called a theater network of house attendants at the building where the UNSCOP committee, all of them men, were being housed. The young women were required to be smart and educated, but above all, in the agency's word, they were required to be daring. Now, they don't explain what daring meant, but whatever the case, these women extracted a wealth of information from the key people who were about to decide Palestine's future. Even Jewish sex workers were involuntarily recruited as spies. They were told that upon the Zionist victory, which they were assured was imminent, they would be executed for sleeping with the enemy, but might be spared if they cooperated now as spies. The practice was so widespread, I find this amazing, the practice was so widespread that a standard questionnaire was printed up that the women were to fill out after each British customer. And that brings us to the self-declaration of the Israeli state in May 1948, exposing the continuum between Zionist pre-state terror and the Israeli state is important, but this history has been largely forgotten. Because of the veneration with which our culture views the nation state, the perception is that the Israeli state was a beginning. This is smoke and mirrors. The state was simply a new, respectable shingle hung on the door of the consolidated terror gangs, now with the power, clout, and respectability of the nation state, and an impunity from the beginning that I find inexplicable and continue to find inexplicable. I know this is an issue about which Tony and I don't completely agree. I'd be curious for him to comment further. After May 15th, 1948, Israel only hastened the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the atrocities, and the seizure of land well beyond that to which it had allegedly agreed, and its refusal to abide by the United Nations, even as it sought and was granted membership in that organization. 4 months into statehood, Israel assassinated Folke Bernadotte, the UN mediator assigned the task of bringing peace to the region, a man who had helped to save 30,000 Jews from the Nazi death camps. Why did they murder him? Well, because Bernadotte insisted on the absolute right of the Palestinians to return to their homes. He insisted on firm borders, and he insisted on Jerusalem and Bethlehem as an international zone, as the Zionists had allegedly agreed in 1947. Now, history books attribute the murder to Lehi, the Stern Gang, but this is incorrect. It's true that Leahy wanted him dead, and it's true that Leahy assassins pulled the trigger, but they were freelancing. They were not working for Leahy. They were working for Ben-Gurion and the Israeli state. 6 days after that murder, Israel shot down a small passenger plane. It held just 6 to 8 people, en route from Beirut to Amman that was following a well-established flight path, but one that now briefly brushed above land newly claimed by Israel. After an initial attack on the passenger plane, the Israeli fighter plane followed it into Jordanian territory, where it attacked twice more. The plane, now half engulfed in flames, the pilot managed to crash land on a rocky field. 3 passengers were dead: John Nixon of the BBC, David Woodford of the Daily Telegraph, and a man named Abu Aswad, about whom nothing further is recorded that I could find. Dr. Ovid Sellers, director of the American School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, and the pilot were badly burned but managed to escape before the plane exploded. They pushed out the windshield from the front. Israel justified its downing of the unarmed passenger plane on the grounds that it had passed through airspace that it now claimed as its own. Yet Israel had been making daily armed and deadly incursions over Jordan and Gaza with impunity, and continued to do so well into the 1950s. Meanwhile, the hundreds of thousands of people ethnically cleansed by Israel because they were not Jewish were now living in the desperate conditions of the refugee camps, and especially those in Gaza were dying from cold, hunger, and disease. The siege of Gaza did not begin after the election of Hamas. The siege began in 1948. Those who tried to go home, or even those in Gaza trying to reach the slightly less horrific conditions in the West Bank, were typically shot dead on sight or captured and tortured, but only in rare cases were the circumstances recorded. I'd like to try to give a very brief but representative sampling of some that were recorded. June 1950, about 120 Palestinians who had attempted to court the crime of going home while not Jewish, and who had been captured and tortured by the Israeli military, were taken to the Wadi Araba region of the Negev and sent on what was intended to be a death march into the desert. This time, it was not the first instance, but this time about 87 survived when they were found by happenstance by the Arab Legion, and their testimony was preserved by outside observers. November of that year, 3 children in the West Bank whose families had been ethnically cleansed by Israel, in fact, they could see their real village down the hill, but they couldn't go there. They were collecting firewood when Israeli soldiers crossed the line and surprised them. One of the children successfully escaped despite taking an IDF bullet in her leg, but the other 2, a 10-year-old girl and her 12-year-old brother, were literally stood up and executed by the soldiers, their parents seeing this up on the hill. Early 1951, a massacre at the village of Sharafat village. On the night of Eastern Christmas Eve, 6th of January 1952, Israel conducted massacres in 3 villages in the Bethlehem area, deliberately timed to coincide with the start of the great midnight procession to the Church of the Nativity. Leaflets were left behind announcing that the massacres were in retaliation for the rape and murder of a Jewish girl in Israel more than a month earlier. Now, this is a fairly involved story that I'll try to condense. There was absolutely no evidence of who the murderers were. And at the time, even the Jerusalem Post had an editorial warning against this knee-jerk reaction in Israel of blaming so-called infiltrators from the West Bank for any crime that happened. In fact, the crime rate, including the violent crime rate in Israel, was off the charts at the time. No evidence had been produced, and Israel had not named a single suspect when at the next meeting of the Multiple Armistice Commission, that it was a UN committee that was tasked with keeping the peace at the armistice line, the provisional border, Israel had given no evidence and not named a single suspect. when the Jordanian representative for the first time put on record the names of the Christmas Eve victims. Once the names were produced, an extraordinary fraud took place openly, but for which the UN could do nothing. One of the Israeli representatives there took the list of the names, left for a few minutes, came back with 3 of the male names copied on a sheet of paper, and said, "Here are our suspects. We didn't want to give them to you before." And reported to the media that, yes, it seems that the names of our suspects were on the Jordanian list, a statement that was technically true, but told a lie. And so Israel posthumously framed 3 of its Christmas Eve victims for the crime. Israel, again, telling the media, completely overwhelming the media with propaganda that the media swallowed up. Interestingly, the fraud meant that the actual murderer of the young woman had to remain free because even the attempt to solve the crime would lay bare the official lie. Okay, June 1952, we'll go to Mount Scopus, an area in northeast Jerusalem that lay on the Palestinian side of the armistice line, but which Israel occupied. Now, the UN tolerated Israel's occupation of Mount Scopus with the stipulation that it not be militarized. Israel, however, was digging trenches along the hill, defying UN demands that it stop, and was smuggling in weapons. Finally, it was caught on June 4th when one of its convoys heading for Mount Scopus was stopped at the UN border crossing, and a UN guard dipped a test rod into one of the oil drums it was transporting. The rod struck a heavy object concealed beneath, to use its words. The driver then used a trick to escape with the truck and the rest of the evidence. But as far as the impounded barrel, it was agreed that it would be opened on June 20th, 12:30 in front of international observers and representatives from both Israel and Jordan. For safekeeping, it was rolled into the bathroom of this particular UN headquarters and locked. That meeting, however, never took place. At noon on the appointed day, 3 Israeli officers with pistols drawn and escorted by 2 IDF soldiers with submachine guns actually commandeered the UN office, prevented the examination of the barrel, replaced the UN's lock on the bathroom with their own lock, kept UN personnel under the gun, and answered the UN's phones. The next step had already by then become standard Israeli practice and remains so today, the smokescreen. Israel issued a formal demand for the immediate replacement of the United Nations personnel involved in this disreputable incident. This is a quote from Israel. So a new date was set, July 10th, to open the barrel. Israel was perfectly happy with the new arrangement now because it now included Israel's friend, a US General William Riley. This also getting into this bizarre relationship between the United States and Israel that dates back to the beginning. And so when, as before, at the new examination, when the rod struck a significant object inside the barrel, to everyone's astonishment, except the Israelis, Riley declared that it would simply be returned to Israel unopened, making the entire peacekeeping mission meaningless since Israel's violations carried no risk. Intimidation of UN personnel was routine, some having to retain bodyguards if they failed to do as Israel demanded. As a matter of policy, every Israeli atrocity was countered with invented countercharges that were presented in ways that made it impossible to follow up. Israel constantly varied its claims, no 2 statements coinciding, with even the place names changing so that a single claim appeared to be many claims. In concert with these methods, Israel subjected Palestine to what was described as skillfully constructed procedural obstruction. The most deadly single attack against Israeli citizens during this period was the so-called Scorpions Pass massacre of 1953, in which an Israeli bus in the Negev was attacked, and to memory, 11 of the 13 passengers were murdered. Now, this followed closely after Israel's most infamous attack on the West Bank, its massacre of the village of Kibbutz. And so the Israeli buses attack, only value to Israel would be to use it to balance its bad press about Kibbutz, which meant that it had to be able to blame the West Bank for the bus attack rather than, as was far more likely, Bedouins seeking revenge or people from Gaza. What followed then was a masterful and multifaceted manipulation of the media, intimidation of UN personnel, corruption and destruction of evidence, all to frame the West Bank in order to be able to propaganda its way out of the scandal of its massacre of Kibbutz. Here again, the crime remains unsolved because Israel could not follow the leads to the murderer, because doing so would lay bare its own propaganda. Meanwhile, throughout this, Britain had a defense treaty with Jordan, but it hoped never to have to make good on it. So the British kept trying to think, well, maybe we can say that Israel is not attacking Jordan. Maybe we can say they were just raiding it. So at what point does this rise to the level that we have to make good on our military obligations? The military, however, was taking this quite seriously, in part because it destabilized Jordan, would invite Soviet intrigue. And so in early 1954, the British were developing secret plans to attack Israel to make it stop attacking the West Bank and Gaza. A summary of Britain's plans dated 27 April 1955 read as follows. This is just a short extract. Neutralize the Israeli Air Force using all the planned reinforcements. Conduct operations against Israeli military targets, in particular centers of communications and oil installations. Now, as I'm sure all of you here know, at the same time as this, it was in secret negotiations with Israel and France to invade Egypt, resulting in the so-called Suez crisis being newspeak for invasion. In this stranger-than-fiction world, Britain was simultaneously preparing to attack Israel while working with Israel to attack Egypt. And neither plan, this is stated explicitly, neither plan necessarily forfeited the other. Britain was actually trying to figure out how to do both according to which came first. But in the end, of course, only one was to come to pass. All through these years, Gaza was a target of Israeli atrocities, such as by strafing. In 1953, the young Ariel Sharon led a ground assault by the notorious Unit 101 to conduct what the relevant UN body called, quote, an appalling case of deliberate mass murder. After Suez, Israeli forces remained in Gaza and began the large-scale execution of civilians and soldiers. According to the UN's figures, within the first 3 weeks of its occupation of Gaza, the Israeli military killed up to 550 civilians, quote, in cold blood and for no apparent reason. Up to 100 more refugees were killed when Israel seized Rafah, and a few hundred more people, about half of whom were refugees from 1948, were executed by Israeli troops upon capturing Khan Yunis. In closing, I'd just like to say the obvious, that Israel has always been rewarded, not punished, but rewarded for its crimes, because rather than being held to account, every new aggression is met with weaker demands by the UN and the so-called international community than the previous unenforced rulings. With each newly emasculated ruling, their impotent predecessors are forgotten, giving Israel the difference. The clock is restarted regarding noncompliance until the next ever weaker and unenforced ruling incrementally lowers the bar of what is feudally demanded of the state. The result, here we are in the midst of a blatant genocide, and yet, as people like Tony and Nick Napier have proven, we can't even publicly support the victims' right of self-defense against their genocide. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you both so much. That was really excellent introductions and really fascinating, thought-provoking stuff. Comrades, please, if you have a question or would like to make a contribution, please click raise hand and I can bring you in, or put your question in the Q&A and I can read it out. Now, Tom and Tony, to come back to you, what some of the things you've said, especially your last point, I thought was very interesting. I mean, Tom, the cruel attacks and stuff on Palestinians by the Israeli state is horrific, and I recommend that comrades get hold of your book, State of Terror, and your other book, Palestine Hijacked. If you could actually put in the chat as well how to get hold of it. I've just had a quick look. It's not on Amazon, but if you have maybe a contact details or something, that would be really useful. But what's interesting, really interesting, is of course Britain's role, as you pointed out. Though, so on the one hand, they're trying to negotiate with Israel. On the other hand, they're trying to stop them, and that goes back to something we discussed last week in the Holocaust industry, which was hugely interesting, which is the question of the international community as it exists, the UN, actually being very critical of Israel's occupation of Palestine and trying to stop it and trying to come to a two-state solution, etc. But at the same time, Israel's no interest in it, and that this all kind of changed the whole outlook on the Holocaust, that this was one of the reasons why the Holocaust was weaponized by Israel, to stop any of those criticisms of the occupation and to stop people looking too closely at the situation in the Middle East. Perhaps Tony and Tom, you could both say a little bit more on that. And Tony, also perhaps you do want to pick up Tom on some of the questions that you might disagree with. Do you want to start, Tony?
Sorry, can you just give me the question in very shortly? So
well, there was one issue on the nation state, I think, where Tom thought you might have disagreements on, and the other thing is the question of the weaponization of the Holocaust. How do you see? Tom described that Britain was, on the one hand, it was trying to stop or thinking about making plans how to stop Israel terror against Palestinians and also the occupation of Gaza and West Bank. On the other hand, of course, they needed Israel and they needed a stable ally, I presume, in the Middle East. What's the imperialist role in dealing with Israel, especially between 48, up to the 6-day war, was an ambivalent one, a little bit, was it? Do you think?
Well, I don't know. I mean, from 1945 onwards, the Zionist movement, the Zionist militias in Palestine were fighting also an insurgency against the British. And the reason why was because the Zionist movement had, in essence, taken a decision during the war that they were going to swap horses. That Britain was seen as a declining imperial power in the Middle East, and the United States was seen as the upcoming power. And their major conference was held, I think it was April 1942, at the Biltmore conference, and there was the Biltmore Declaration. It was the first time they'd openly called for a Jewish state. Before then, they always described their aims as in, if you like, euphemisms, but now they were clear they wanted to go for a Jewish state, and they proclaimed it openly. And of course, amongst themselves, they were always clear. I mean, Herzl's pamphlet, The Jewish State, was published in 1897, don't forget. But Britain, of course, had other irons in the fire, and its strongest ally in the region was in Jordan. It commanded Glubb Pasha's Arab Legion, which successfully resisted the attempts to conquer the West Bank the first time around in 1948. It was British officered Glubb Pasha. And so, yes, there was a conflict with British imperialism. Although, despite that fact, the British laid the basis for the catastrophe, the Nakba, which happened. I mean, they failed to protect the Palestinians. They urged that they comply. They did it. I mean, they realized that the Zionists would, despite their differences, the Zionists were on their side. I mean, that's the only way I could describe it. And very quickly, after initial skirmishes, actually British aircraft, I think, were shot down by the Israeli Air Force at one point in 1948. Tom would know more about that history than me, but despite that fact, I mean, there was clearly a recognition that Zionism was a pro-imperialist force. So come Suez, for example, when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, and of course, everyone threw up their hands in horror. I mean, there was the belief, I mean, it was common to all the imperialists, Britain and France in particular, that, well, these backward Egyptians couldn't run it. They couldn't steer the ships through the canal. I mean, there's this kind of racism that you see from imperialism. And at a conference, it was in Sèvres in France, Selwyn Lloyd from Britain, the French premier, whose name escapes me, and Ben Gurion, basically plotted to gain the Suez Canal back. And the plan was that Israel would attack Egypt under some pretext or other, and Britain and France would go in order to separate the parties, but in reality to attack Egypt. Eisenhower saw through that, as most other people did, and he made it clear he wasn't happy with that. And the Americans engineered a run on the pound, and very soon Britain and France were holding up the white flag. But I mean, Britain had seen Israel as their imperial partner throughout. But up to 1967, of course, the imperialists, until they were convinced that Israel could be a hammer of Arab nationalism, they hedged their bets. I mean, they were always supportive of Israel in many ways, but they didn't make it too obvious. Come 1967 and what was called the Six-Day War, when Israel demonstrated its might, they humiliated Nasser and so on, the Americans swung over quite overtly. I mean, the beginning, I think, of their annual subsidy to Israel, which is, I think, $3.8 billion now, though they've given them so much during the genocide in Gaza. I mean, it must be in the tens of billions, in fact. So, I mean, yes, imperialism didn't jump into bed overnight with Israel, but they recognized that Israel was carrying out its work for it, not least in coercing the Arab regimes and ensuring that there was no revolutions in the Arab East. When Mubarak was overthrown in Egypt in 2011, I mean, Netanyahu was almost in tears at the loss of his friend, because nothing served Israel's purpose better than the Arab dictatorships, although Israel always contrasts itself as the only democracy in the Middle East, which is wearing a bit thin now. But one can't just see Israel as simply a tool or extension of imperialism. It has its own interests as well, and it will conflict at times with the United States. But, I mean, when push comes to shove, the United States gives way. I mean, it may tick Israel off. It may say it shouldn't go so far, but it doesn't stop the arms shipments. I mean, Reagan stopped supplying arms during the Lebanese invasion in '82. Biden has been supplying the genocidalists. I mean, that is the difference. I mean, there is wall-to-wall support from the imperialists now for Israel. I don't think there's any doubt. Their only concern is the Houthis are attacking their shipping. They're not concerned about any other breaches of international law. I mean, this is the hypocrisy of imperialism. But let's face it, there's nothing Israel's doing in Gaza the United States hasn't done in Iraq. I mean, there is no morality for imperialism and the so-called international community, the rules-based order and all that. I mean, it's just a fiction, isn't it?
I'd like to comment. Tony raised a very interesting point about the Israeli attack on British planes. What happened, it's an important point to bring out. At the end of 1948, Israel was defying U.S. demands that it stop its incursions in the Gaza Sinai region, and Israel had blocked UN observers from checking to see what was going on. As a result, Britain sent small Spitfires from Egypt to just to see what the Israelis were doing. Israel shot down three British planes. There were I may have the numbers of planes shot down.
I think that's right.
I think there were 3 British planes shot down, 2 British pilots killed. What's interesting is, and this was over non-Israeli territory. This was over Gaza or the Sinai. What I find interesting in terms of the chemistry of the West in regards to Israel is that Winston Churchill, later on, in letters I found of his in the archives here, Winston Churchill sided with Israel and actually accused Ernest Bevin, who had been the foreign secretary, of anti-Semitism for criticizing Israel for shooting down British planes and killing British pilots. Also in this letter, it is clear, it is explicit that Churchill identifies the Israeli state with the kingdom in the Old Testament.
Thank you, comrades. One question I think that Tony's contribution raised is the illusion in international justice, and clearly there are different moral reasons being used. If you look at Israel, what Israel's doing, and you look at any other country that is being, Ukraine, obviously that war, how refugees are being treated, etc. What do you both think then of? I mean, Tony made reference to the South African submission to the International Court of Justice, but this is will any justice be served? What is the point of an action like that? I mean, it's obviously good that it's being exposed, but do you expect any justice to be served by this court?
Who wants to go first? You, Tom, or me? I mean, I'll go first if you want.
Go first, Tony. Yeah.
I think it's extremely welcome that South Africa has done what it's done, and it shows the Arab regimes which could have done the same in the true light. They are collaborationists. They go along with everything with imperialism, because let's face it, the Arab states could stop the oil, and in 1 week the Americans would ensure that Israel got out of Gaza. I mean, that's the reality. And the other reality is that some of those regimes, like Saudi Arabia, are not unhappy at what is happening in Gaza. I mean, that is the truth of it. But what South Africa has done, it's the legacy of its own struggle against apartheid, it is to be welcomed by everyone. And the speeches on the first day, which the BBC didn't show, they only showed the Israeli case, of course. We expect this from our neutral state broadcaster, was an excellent submission. I've gone through part of it, and it cannot be faulted for how it's documented the genocidal intent of the Israeli state. What will happen next? Well, there's massive political pressure on the judges not to issue an interim order instructing Israel to cease what it's doing. So we cannot expect the court, I think it will fudge it, but I may be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, but that's my fear. They may come out with some palliatives, but I don't expect a clear-cut decision by any means, because this is political, it's not legal at all. But just suppose that the court did issue an interim injunction. I have no doubt that Israel would ignore it. It would be taken to the UN Security Council. America would veto it, and then it would go to the UN General Assembly. And we can see, I mean, the obvious step would be for Israel to be expelled or suspended from the United Nations. Somehow, I don't expect that to happen. Because in the end of the day, the rules-based order has no rules except what the United States lays down. I mean, it's a fiction, of course. International law, in many ways, is a fiction because there's no effective mechanism of enforcement. So people should shed their illusions. I mean, the UN has served as an instrument of US foreign policy, by and large, throughout its existence. Yeah, that's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Tom.
Oh, I think, as everyone would agree, the action by South Africa is absolutely important, even if nothing comes of it. And it's important for the same reason that BDS is important, simply that it puts the issue out there in the public eye. BDS is not going to bring the Israeli state down, but what it does is it forces the question: you're boycotting Israel, such a nice state. Why are you doing that? That's the importance of BDS. And in a similar vein, that is the importance of what South Africa has done. Even with bad coverage, at least the word genocide and the Israeli state are seen together in the mass media for the Western public. That in itself makes the whole thing worthwhile.
That is true, yes, though I do agree with Tony. I don't think we can expect, yes, Israel is a genocidal country and it's pursuing, but still it is a good thing it's been coming out. Thank you both. Adrian, please.
Yes, my question is obvious from everything we've heard and the things that we also know, most of us coming here, is that capitalism and its offshoot imperialism is the root of the problem. So I'm wondering, it would be good to have some discussion on the need and the to facilitate a national and international, movement for socialism and against capitalism, and education of it is naming it and then organizing against it. Because there's the tendency to talk around it about its impact and what it's done and the evil and the horrendous, effects of it, but to target it consciously and publicly, educate and target it. And I think that's important. And I wonder what you guys think about that. I'm a socialist and a Trotskyist, and I think we need a national US revolution for socialism and an international revolution for socialism. So I'm curious what do you think? I know the problem is horrible, but what is the solution?
Easy. One solution, revolution. Well, we need one in Britain as well, because we're based here in Britain, but thank you, Adrian.
Right.
I'm going to suggest I'm going to take one more person before I bring you both back in. We've got, Gada Kami is in the audience. I'll bring you in first. Hi, Gada. Nice to see you.
Yeah, hello. And I salute both the speakers for absolutely outstanding contributions. Now, I had to unfortunately leave the webinar briefly, and then I'm back, but I hope what I'm about to raise has not already been raised. It's become very clear, I think, that the latest complicity and impunity provided to Israel through this unprecedented series of brutalities and monstrous behavior. So leads me to ask you, why is that? What is implies that Israel is so precious, it is so important that there is some consensus on not going against it, indulging it, allowing it to do to commit monstrous crimes because it's precious. That's the behavior of states which regard Israel as being of exceptional value. So I'm asking both of you, what is that value? What do you think?
Okay, do you want to reply to those two first questions? Tony first and then Tom?
Yeah, okay, I'll deal with Adrian's first. I consider myself a Marxist and a revolutionary socialist, though not a Trotskyist. I would like to see socialism worldwide, but for various reasons, we have not seen revolution in the Western world or in the global South, for that matter. We've seen anti-imperialist struggles against, if you like, the emanation of capitalism in those countries and the effects that it has. But there are all sorts of reasons. I mean, I could spend half an hour on those or my analysis of why that is the case. But the fact is, it hasn't happened, and we can't simply, if you like, say, well, we're going to fight for socialism, therefore we ignore the struggles that take place in the living world, because it's through supporting the struggles of people against imperialism and colonialism that you have the chance of then extending those struggles into a fight against a system that produces that oppression. So I don't think we should ever counterpose the fight for socialism and against capitalism with the fight against imperialism. As regards Garda's question, why is Israel given the support it is? I think that the reason has to be because capitalism and imperialism are amoral. They have no values except, if you like, the bottom line of their accounts. It also has, of course, no judgment in terms of any longer term perspectives. So, I mean, the United States, it could be quite easily argued, it is provoking a catastrophe in the Middle East, which will in the end hurt its own interest. But it doesn't have that perspective. It simply struggles from day to day to define its enemies, and whether it's China or Russia or whoever. And we know from the United States' involvement in its own wars, Vietnam, Cambodia, Iraq, and so on, that it is capable of all sorts of atrocities. I mean, in Vietnam, it killed 2 to 3 million Vietnamese. Why should it object to genocide in Gaza? I mean, there is simply no morality when it comes to US or British foreign policy. And that is what we have to cope with. On the one hand, the pretensions to democracy, but on the other hand, the reality of it. So, I mean, we see in Britain that, when people start supporting the Palestinians, the police are cracking down and the state is cracking down. We saw Suella Braverman describing marches which were, if you like, full of hope and joy as hate marches. That is how they see it. And you may be aware that I was arrested before Christmas because I'd posted a tweet which said, in the war against Israel, I will support anyone, including Hamas. So, I mean, we can see how the British state is, if you like, reducing our own democratic rights in this country in order to support what is really an Israeli police state and the devastation that is caused in Gaza. So, I mean, the two are interlinked, but we live in an extremely rotten system. And so we do have to combine, if you like, our opposition to this system, which, I mean, George Soros described it as amoral. He's probably one of the rather brighter rich people abound on this earth. And it is. I mean, there is no morality when it comes to international capitalism. And it will prey on and will act as a predator in the global South. And it will use agencies like the Israeli state, or indeed the Indian state and what it's doing in Kashmir. Very, very similar. So I can't give you a definitive answer, but Israel is seen as the guarantor of Western interests. Sorry, Garda seems to have disappeared. Oh no, sorry, you're not. I thought for a moment you had. That is the best example I can give. And I noticed that the German state has even offered to join Israel in the international courts. I mean, all I can say is that the German state, having never been denazified, obviously sees a cousin and a twin in what Israel is doing now. It probably helps relieve its conscience over what it did in the past.
I think that's more it's the collective guilt of the Holocaust that makes Germany.
Well, it's the way it transforms itself, that collective guilt.
Yeah, it's not without opposition though. Tom, there is though a strategic interest for imperialism as well to support Israel. Surely.
Well, yeah, as far as socialism, it's not my topic. I don't see a link that is close enough that it is an avenue to pursue in terms of Palestine. And certainly, even if a socialist revolution were to help Palestine, the Palestinians can't wait that long. That I don't think of it as an issue in regard to Palestine. I might be wrong about that, but that's my reaction. In terms of Rada's question, it's a question that I think a lot about that and for which I have no answer. The reason, when I spoke earlier, the reason I mentioned the so-called barrel incident when the U.S. intervened to allow Israel to take away its evidence where it was concealing weapons in an oil barrel going to Mount Scopus, was the way that it treated the UN to actually militarily take over a UN facility and hold the UN people under submachine gun guard. And this was not the only time this happened. This also happened on the border of Egypt and elsewhere. Now, how do you explain this? How do you explain that this country that after its self-declaration defied the UN completely while it was requesting admission to the UN, was admitted, and then immediately broke its promise of cooperating if admitted, and only exacerbated all its defiance of the UN. And things only got worse and worse from that. Its behavior to the UN was criminal, and yet nothing happens. And in regards to the United States, of course, yes, as Tony and I discussed last time we were here with you, of course, with the United States, there's AIPAC, there's the Christian Zionist vote, there's the arms sales, there's all this stuff. And in my mind, you add it all up, and it does not explain the degree of U.S. fealty to Israel, nor the UN's degree of fealty to Israel. I'm sorry, to me, I add this up and the math doesn't work. How to explain it, I don't know, but I think it's a very important issue for breaking this cycle of genocide.
Thank you. Carol, please, has a question or comment.
Actually, Tony did mention something related to this just now. I was absolutely astonished to learn today that Thatcher actually banned arms sales to Israel in 1982 because of the invasion of Lebanon. And this was in place from 1982 to 1994. So, what was different then to now, where all these imperialists, the US, UK, are absolutely backing Israel to the hilt. And back in 82, actually, Biden said, I think it was 86 actually, Biden said, if Israel hadn't been there, we'd have to invent it in the Middle East. We'd have to invent an Israel in the Middle East. So how come, I was astonished, how come Thatcher actually banned arms sales to Israel from 1982 to 1994, which was 12 years, and yet today we're seeing completely the opposite situation? The other question I have, and I don't know how much relevance this has to this discussion, but Saudi Arabia has been attacking Yemen for about 10 years, I believe. How does all this fit in? Obviously, they're going to go from there because of the Houthi rebels that are trying to prevent shipping getting to Israel. But how does this all fit in to the picture? Thank you.
Tony, do you want to? Let me take one more person. Actually, we have quite a lot of people still who've got their hands up. Matthew, please.
Hi, comrades. Yeah, thanks for the discussion. That's been very interesting. I think there's a few things. I mean, I think the other thing about the South African submission. I mean, okay, also as it's a formal legal submission in front of everyone. Is it also indicts the entire system? I mean, when they say, okay, the Israelis are guilty of genocide, I mean, everybody can see that actually, of course, they're charging the US, the UK, and virtually every imperialist politician with the same thing, because they're all, in on the entire business. None of them have varied from supporting Israel in terms of arms shipments and political support and so on and so forth. So in those terms, it's extremely important. But what we're looking at, obviously, is the decay of Israel, the actual Israeli state itself and the Israeli political system, which is producing this. At the same time, of course, obviously the decay of the US system as well. And as you pointed out, obviously they will back the Israelis as a key point of their control of the Middle East. How could they give it up at this point? They don't have any alternatives. I think there's a couple of other points. I mean, in terms of support for the start of Israel, the other factor, of course, was the support of the Stalinists. And actually, of course, the Czechs shipped a very large quantity of weapons to the Israelis in from sort of 48, 49. So there was this fairly immediate support from the Stalinists. And obviously, then, clearly with the importance of Stalinist politics, I mean, the thing is that Stalinism had considerable support within the Middle East itself. Was a major factor in a number of countries, and so the establishment of the whole thing actually owes a considerable amount to the Stalinists as well. And the pretense of being on the left and so on. And actually, of course, what they've done is allow and facilitate the construction of this racist Zionist state. The other thing I think is interesting, of course, is the attack on the USS Liberty in 1967, in which it's not exactly clear how that was dealt with. I mean, apart from obviously the Israelis paid some compensation to the US for heavily damaging their spy ship and killing a very large section of its crew. As to basically, did they manage to convince the Americans this was an accident, or did they just say, okay, well, it's there, so we'll it's fair game? If people can say something about that, it'd be useful.
Tony, do you want to make a start?
Yeah, I mean, if I deal with Carol's points first, I mean, the British ruling class has had strong relationships with the Arab regimes, whether it was in Kuwait, Iraq, of course, the Anglo-Iraqi Petroleum Company, or Iran under the Shah, and so on. Jordan, of course, especially so, because Jordan was separated out from the Palestine Mandate in 1923. And so those regimes, which were antagonistic to the Zionists when they came, the Israeli state, the British would have reflected that, and you would have had what you were called Arabists at the Foreign Office. And the last really Arabist foreign secretary who resigned, I think during or just after the Falklands War, was Lord Carrington, who was probably also the brightest, Peter Carrington, and his two junior ministers also resigned. They would have been seen, they would have oriented towards the Arab countries as much as Israel. But as US hegemony has increased in the Middle East, and as Britain's power has waned, so Britain has followed the United States in giving ever more backing. Don't forget, in 1982, when Thatcher instituted the ban on arms, the United States under Reagan did it likewise. So the United States too was not, if you like, completely in the pocket of the Zionists. I'm not saying that they are, but they weren't as fulsome in their support as they are today and have been. I mean, it's a phenomenon you see in the United States that each successive US president is more pro-Zionist than his predecessor. I mean, no one could have been more pro-Zionist than Donald Trump, except for Joe Biden. I mean, that is the reality. And, if you employ a guard dog, I mean, you might occasionally kick it if it doesn't disobeys you, but you don't want to really hurt it because it might not do what you want. So, I mean, that's the case with Israel, that there will be attempts to rein it in. You might send Anthony Blinken back and forth 4 or 5 times, but at the end of the day, if Israel is determined on a course of war, then the United States is not going to stop them, however much it may protest. And that, if you like, is my explanation. Given that the United States is, well, it's in confrontation with Russia via the NATO proxy war in Ukraine. It's got a pivot to China via the AUKUS Pact in the Pacific. It relies on Israel, if you like, through the Abraham Accords to, if you like, cement the relationships with the worst, most reactionary Arab regimes in order to deal with, if you like, usurpers like the Houthis. So, of course, when the Houthis start interfering with shipping, then the United States is all in favor of international law, but international law goes by the board when it comes to Gaza, for example. We just have to accept this hypocrisy. I mean, that is all to it. I mean, there is no longer really a debate in the US ruling class about the merits of supporting Israel versus the Arab regimes. I think that debate has largely been settled. I'm just having a look. I mean, Matthew's right. I mean, Stalinist foreign policy. I mean, Stalin about turned in 1947 and supported the UN resolution creating Israel. He did it for the most nakedly selfish and stupid of reasons. He saw Israel as a means of getting Britain out of the Middle East. And he, you know, I mean, that was Stalinism. It had no understanding or analysis of the factors at work, because the UK was clearly a declining imperialist power post 45. It was in hock to the United States. I mean, it had gone to the United States in 45 for a $3 billion loan, which is worth God knows how much now because it was bankrupt. The United States pressing for Britain to end imperial preference in the British colonies so the American capitalism could ravage their markets and so on. So you had all of those tensions, but that would explain, if you like, the rivalry, in a sense, which culminated in Suez, where America taught Britain and France a lesson that it was top dog in the Middle East and it wouldn't countenance interference in any of its strategic interests. And Britain took that on board. And that was when you had the development of the independent nuclear deterrent Polaris, or rather reliance on America for the so-called independent nuclear deterrent. I mean, in many ways, British foreign policy should be seen as developing from Suez in 1956. The Stalinists, well, what can you say? They got Britain out of the Middle East and they had America instead. What it did do was weaken the strong Arab communist parties who were then seen as supporting Zionism. So it completely undermined them in Iraq, in Egypt, and in Syria. Utterly, totally stupid, but that was the nature of Stalinist foreign policy, that it wasn't concerned with revolution abroad, but simply safeguarding its own interests. As for the USS Liberty, I mean, the right wing, if you like, the far right in the United States goes on about this a lot. Those that don't support Israel, so they are a minority. I think it was simply that Israel took a decision that it couldn't afford the possibility that a US spy ship might reveal details of what was happening to their enemies, so they took it out. There's no doubt about it. I mean, America wasn't very happy, but Johnson realized the factors at play and played it down, and Israel paid compensation. But of course, those who survived on the ship are to this day very bitter about what happened. I have to say, I'm not that concerned about Israel attacking an American ship. I think I only wish it could do a bit more of that. But anyway, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Tom?
As far as the USS Liberty, I think actually it's very important that the story of the Israeli attack be better known for the simple reason that it's pragmatically useful, that it will question the U.S. attitude towards Israel. And although Johnson swept the issue under the rug, some of his top people, in fact, was it Dean Rusk who actually wrote about this? Some of his top people later, privately, said that they never believed a word of the Israeli line, that it was a deliberate attack. One can argue which of the 2 or 3 possible reasons for the attack, but the fact that it was deliberate, I think, is not controversial anymore. As far as Carol's point about Thatcher, I have nothing more to add than what Tony said, except a question: was the embargo in fact adhered to? I don't know that it wasn't, but I do know that, for example, in 1948, in theory, Britain was not selling weapons to either side, but underhandedly, they were selling weapons to Israel, despite the public ban.
Sorry, Carol, did you want to say something?
No, I have no idea. And the source that I read it from, I think it was from an old private eye, actually. It didn't seem to indicate that this was flagrantly ignored. It seemed to be that it was in place. So yes, they went ahead and banned arms sales to Israel for 12 years.
Thatcher was also none too pleased with Israel when the cartoonist was assassinated. What was his name?
The cartoonist. Gosh.
The famous cartoonist that Israel hired a Jordanian to assassinate.
No, you've got me there.
Well, sorry, I don't know either. I'll bring in Virginia in the meantime, who's got a question. Hi, comrade.
Thanks. I originally raised a question which Tony sort of answered Carol's question about Thatcher and his point about Reagan. But just a bit further to that, it was 1982, wasn't, say, 1989, and the Soviet Union was still in existence. So you had that kind of pressure, I would have thought, on the United States. And also, it does seem, as I read recently, that Reagan's remark to Rabin, was, we don't want the image of a 7-month-old child with its arms blown off to be seen. So he was afraid of reputational damage, clearly, and clearly the Senate didn't disagree with him. I'm not saying that Biden is not a force on his own. Well, and regardless of the Senate, possibly, but yeah. So it was a different period of time. So if you want to comment on the fact that there was the existing Soviet Union to affect, just as it affected the civil rights movement, and in fact the fact that you had the so-called left regime called the Soviet Union. But also, another point I wanted to sort of ask about what you think about is when Mearsheimer and Welch wrote, American Foreign Policy and the Lobby, whatever it was called, the title was referring to AIPAC. There was a lot of consternation on the left, saying this really is saying the tail is wagging the dog, and that's not true. And in fact, Joseph Mossad, who was a Palestinian-born professor at Columbia, at least he was then, I'm not sure now, but he had been having a lot of trouble. The AIPAC had tried to get him to lose his job, but he had written a paper himself saying that, it's ridiculous for Arab states to think that American foreign policy is run by Israel. But I just wanted to, if either of you have, or anybody has any comment to make about the change between, say, Mearsheimer and Walt's book and now, and also the fact that in 1982, you know, they had the reputational damage to consider in light of the fact that the Soviet Union still existed. That was it. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Virginia. Okay, I think that was our last question from the floor. Comrades, both Tony and Tom, if in your answer you could also perhaps sum up your any contributions or sum up your general idea about this topic, Zionism, during the Holocaust and after, and what we learned from this session, perhaps. Tony first.
Okay, thank you. I don't have a great deal to say. John Mearsheimer and Stephen Waltz, who I think are both based at Chicago University, are from the Realist School of Political Science, which in essence argues that America, by its alliances and by its current foreign policy, is actually not pursuing its own interests. And for instance, in Ukraine, that it should be, it's a diversion, it should be concentrating on China. Likewise, it sees US foreign policy is overly influenced by AIPAC and the domestic Zionist lobby. I don't really agree with them, but in any case, imperialism is often not logical, even when following its own interests. I mean, you have all these American think tanks which debate what is in their interest, where it should go, and so on. But at the end of the day, these are very subjective matters because they always leave out the agency of the oppressed, and that's the one factor that is missing. I mean, I think in the case of Israel, it is simply that, as someone's put in the chat, what Alexander Haig, Reagan's Secretary of State, said around 1982, that Israel was America's unsinkable aircraft carrier and it doesn't have a single American soldier there. Not true, by the way, but anyway. I think that basically pertains to today, that America is not going to kick its watchdog, even when there are minor differences. Of course, they would like to see a kind of Bantustan come Palestinian state that was neutered, but that goes against the whole ethos of Zionism, which is that the land is ours, all of the land is ours, and that Palestinians don't exist and should be grateful that we even allow them to live there. So that is the situation as it is. What I talked about was really that the main, if you like, justification, the main propaganda weapon of Israel and the Zionist movement today, as it has been, is that all its enemies are anti-Semites. Furthermore, that October the 7th was a massive pogrom against Israel, and that the Palestinians and Hamas attacked them, not because they've oppressed them, not because they've occupied them, but merely because they're Jewish. In other words, if everything Gaza had suffered had been carried out by people of another religion, the Palestinians presumably would have been extremely happy about it. It was just that Israel is a Jewish state. I mean, that is obviously a complete and utter nonsense. Palestinians fight because they're oppressed, whatever the color or religion of their oppressor. And I think it's important ideologically to call out these arguments when Israel accuses its enemies of anti-Semitism. We have to say, no, it's you who has most in common with the anti-Semites. You always have had. And today, I mean, the main lobby in the United States is not a Jewish lobby. It's a Christian Zionist lobby, which is inherently anti-Semitic. I mean, its whole end times religious theology is anti-Semitic. It envisages the destruction of millions of Jews in order that they can rapture to heaven, you know, if you go along with this nonsense. And historically, you know, I mean, all the major figures who are pro-Zionist were anti-Semitic. Arthur Balfour, Winston Churchill, I mean, you name them. Anti-Semitism and Zionism fit like a hand into a glove. And that was no different during the Nazi era. I mean, disgusting as it may seem, even while the Holocaust victims were alive at the beginning in 1942. The Zionist movement was holding a debate and discussion, and this is in Tom Segev's book, The Seventh Million, on how to memorialize them. So even while they were alive, they were thinking about how best to commemorate and exploit their deaths. So the idea for Yad Vashem took place even before the Holocaust was underway or the extermination camps were underway. That is the nature of Zionism, I'm afraid. And that is why today in Israel, the Holocaust survivors who still are alive, over a third of them live in absolute dire poverty. I mean, the Holocaust is not actually about the Jews who died. It's about the way that Zionism uses what happens for its own purposes. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thanks for summing up so well. Tom, please. You are muted, comrade, sorry.
Tom, can't hear you.
You're still muted.
You're muted.
Yes, sorry. As far as Mearsheimer and Wald, I think the book was very useful as something of a wake-up call to that small part of the U.S. public that read it and thought about it. But pretty much agreeing with Tony, the question is the U.S. relationship with Israel is not necessarily in the U.S.'s interest, but what does it mean for something to be in the U.S.'s interests? And that then begs the larger question to me of what I consider to be the fraud of United States democracy, where the inertia of the country does not go in line with what the people as a whole want, because simply the mechanics of the voting system are so flawed as to be undemocratic to begin with. But far more importantly than that, pulling levers in a voting booth has no meaning unless the people, the public pulling those levers, are voting based on comprehensive and accurate information, which is comprehensively denied the U.S. public unless they look elsewhere. So the very system that we call the democracy of the United States does not serve the interests of the people as a whole, and most certainly does not serve the interests of the underprivileged. So this whole idea of what is to the benefit of the United States is the question that one needs to answer before one can answer whether the love affair with Israel is or is not to its benefit. But as far as my key point here tonight, it's really the key point that I always try to make, which is that we collectively must acknowledge and must not be afraid to state that the problem with the horror that is happening now, it is not a problem of Israel being misguided. It's not a problem of Israel doing something, in quotes, wrong. No, the problem is the Israeli state itself. The Israeli state is not making a mistake in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and within so-called Israel proper. No, the Israeli state is doing what it was designed to do. We have to face that, and only when we face that will there be peace and justice and equality in the region, river to sea.
Thank you both very much. We will be revisiting all of these questions again. In fact, we have a session with Gaza. The last session is one state, two states, or something altogether differently. We'll also look at the Nasser period, which was very important. And next week, of course, we have both speakers back discussing anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. This will be a very interesting discussion. We've already touched on it, of course, today, the relationship between, Zionists and anti-Semitism that Tony spoke to at length. But next week, we're also looking at the weaponization of the IHRA misdefinition of anti-Semitism, for example. So I'm really looking forward to that. And there was a bit of a flurry, and I have to say a couple of things quickly on this question. Socialism, and why don't we talk about socialism? Without socialism, we're all ruined anyway, and there can't be a solution to the situation in the Middle East. I kind of agree to a degree. I'm a Marxist myself, but clearly, just calling socialism at the situation in Israel is not helping at the moment. What we need to understand is how capitalism works, how the situation, how Israel works in Palestine, Israel concretely, so that we actually can think this through, how we can provide leadership, how we can provide answers to the working class in Palestine and also in Israel. I think without an understanding of what's going on, just calling, we need to be calling for socialism is not going to cut it at the moment. So our series is really an attempt to provoke and well, firstly, to provide answers, to provide understanding of the situation. I think both speakers tonight were absolutely excellent in explaining what's going on. And this will help us as well to formulate alternatives, I believe. Though, socialism is not at the moment on the agenda in the Middle East. Sorry, Tony.
Yeah, Tina, can I just give advance notice to people that on Holocaust Memorial Day, that's the 27th of January, because the Zionists obviously use it to, if you like, reinforce their message. We are holding, that's the Socialist Labour Network and the Jewish Network for Palestine, we're holding a meeting with Ilan Pappy, who's the most famous Israeli professor, Ronnie Kasriels, who was the military commander of the ANC, Stephen Kapos, who was forced out of the Labour Party last year and is himself a Holocaust survivor, Gada Karmi, and myself. So that's Saturday, 27th of January, 7 o'clock, but I'll be doing a blog on it anyway. Okay,
Excellent.
and I put the link in the chat if you want to register. Thank
Tony,
you.
where is that? Where does that take
It's on
place?
Zoom. 7 o'clock, 27th of January. Okay.
We can put it in the next email bulletin we're putting out, so everybody's gonna see it. So good. Thank you very much, comrades, for attending this excellent session, and we'll see both the speakers and hopefully all the audience next week. We've had over 150 people all in all in the session, which is good. So thank you very much, comrades, and good night.